Insects are disappearing across the world.
If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. That is not an option. It's the ecosystems on this planet that keep humans alive.
Scientists warn us that the insect apocalypse is entirely possible.
As we expand the human population, we keep making these sterile landscapes and nature is pushed out.
Without the ecological services that insects provide, we are doomed. Insects are the most abundant animals on Earth. It's estimated that the total weight of our insect population is at least 17 times greater than all of humanity. They provide the essential services necessary to support life. They pollinate about 80% of all plants, including about 75% of our food crops. They decompose dead plants and animals and thereby recycle nutrients back into the system. They manage the soil. And they are the essential food base for other animals, especially birds and freshwater fish. Annual ecosystem services provided by wild insects in the US have been estimated at $57 billion. Scientists have identified and described about 66,000 animal and fish species. In contrast, insect species add up to about 1 million, and the number, yet to be identified, could amount to another 20 million or more. There are more than 160,000 kinds of moths in the world. Butterflies add up to about 17,500 species. There are nearly 20,000 types of bees and more than 12,000 kinds of ants. Beetle species total nearly 400,000. In light of those huge numbers, it's easy to believe that the insect abundance is endless. But is it? As these trillions upon trillions of insects remain busy with essential ecological tasks, entomologists and concerned citizen scientists are noticing troubling trends in the woods, fields, and backyards. Is it possible that the world's insect population is beginning to crash? Scientists knew there were serious ecological problems stemming from habitat loss, climate change, and the pervasive use of pesticides and herbicides. But there was little data to quantify the extent of the damage to insect populations, and nothing to support a global alarm, until a long-term study by a German entomological club came to light. The Krefeld Entomological Society near Dusseldorf has collected and curated insect specimen records since 1864. Over the years, these citizen scientists maintain a rigidly consistent collection program, and they preserved the insects they caught using standardized nets and meticulous identification and storage routines. In later years, they were noticing fewer and fewer insects filling their jars and boxes from their seasonal trips to 63 nature preserves, representing virtually every type of natural habitat in the region. They employed a unique method of weighing their collection and shared the results with university scientists, who confirmed a 76% seasonal decline over the previous 27 years. And the midsummer decline amounted to a shocking 82%. it was time to sound the alarm. Ecology professor and author Dr. Dave Goulson of the University of Sussex explains the situation.
There's one aspect of insect declines that people have noticed, particularly if they're of a certain age, I guess maybe 50 or more years old. 'Cause I can remember when I was a kid that if we drove any distance in the summer, we'd have to stop and clean the windscreen of the car every hour or two, because it would be literally impossible to see through because it was covered in splattered insects. Today, that just doesn't happen.
In 2014, a panel of scientists synthesized current insect population studies and found that most of the monitored species had declined on average by 45%.
This disappearance of insects is something that people should take really seriously, because whatever you think about them, insects are vitally important to every single human on the planet. They're kind of intimately involved in more or less every ecological process that you can think of: nutrient cycling, keeping the soils healthy, breaking down dead bodies, dead trees, leaves, biocontrol, controlling pest numbers, and so on and so on. And most famously, of course, they pollinate our crops. 75% of the crops we grow globally require insect pollination, so we wouldn't have a whole swathe of fruits and vegetables that we require to keep us healthy. Everything from apples and cherries to blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, tomatoes, squashes, pumpkins, I could go on and on and on. It even includes coffee and chocolate, all require insect pollination. So life would be pretty miserable without these things. And the horrible truth is that millions of people would starve to death if we didn't have insect pollinators. So whatever you think about insects, we need them and we need to look after them. So far as we know, insect declines are being driven by a whole bunch of different factors. Probably the biggest globally is habitat loss, from the tropical forests to the flower-rich hay meadows of the UK. In the UK, 100 years ago, we had about 7 million hectares of flower-rich grasslands, hay meadows and chalk downland that would have been teeming with butterflies and bumblebees and all sorts of other insects. And we destroyed 97% of it in the 20th century. And so habitat loss is a big one. But then on top of that, and kind of associated with it, a lot of that habitat loss is to intensive farming, which involves a lot of pesticide use. A whole barrage of insecticides and fungicides and herbicides are going on to farmland all the time. We shouldn't really be surprised if they disappear.
This issue seems to have come upon us quickly.
Large-scale declines that have happened within my lifetime, and to think that more than half the butterflies have gone since I was a kid is really disturbing. And it's not just Europe, it's certainly happening in North America. There's good data on monarch butterflies and how they've been faring, but they've all but disappeared.
Scientists estimate that a complete insect population collapse would mean the end of human life within 2 months. What then are our prospects for a positive outcome?
Good news, insects can recover. Rather few of them have gone extinct yet, lots of them heading towards it, but if we take action now, it's not too late. And the nice thing about insects is they actually breed very quickly given the right conditions, so they could recover in no time at all if we gave them somewhere to live, something to eat, stop poisoning them, and so on.
But insects need places to recover, and our scattered collection of nature parks and forests won't be enough. Right now, at least 85% of the land east of the Mississippi is privately owned, and much of that property is a monoculture of suburban and urban lawns, or is being used for large-scale food production. Landscapes that for insect and ecological purposes might as well be parking lots. In short, we've drained, cut, and paved nature, and we've carved it into pieces too small and isolated to sustain the native insects and animals that make our ecosystems work. Douglas Ptolemy, the chief entomology professor at the University of Delaware, has a New York Times bestseller out, Nature's Best Hope. And he has a plan.
If you look at the way we landscape, humans are here and nature someplace else, and then there's no more someplace else's. And as we expand the human population, we keep making these sterile landscapes and nature is pushed out. So that is why things are declining.
You might think that with so many species of insects in their abundance, the system should be able to adjust to human population expansion and lifestyles. But that's not how it works. In fact, 90% of the insects that eat plants develop and reproduce only on certain plants, with which they share an evolutionary history.
Specialization is really common in the world of insects, both with pollinators and with the insects that eat plants. We've got over 4,000 species of native bees, and at least a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plant genera. And the reason all these insects are so specialized is because plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction, so they protect their tissues with nasty compounds. And the insects have to adapt to those phytochemicals in order to be able to eat the plant. So they develop specialized enzymes and behaviors and life history adaptations that minimize their exposure to these compounds. But the monarch, for example, is good at milkweeds, but it wouldn't be able to handle oak trees. And that's why if you want to have caterpillars in your yard, you need to have the plants that create those caterpillars. They're not going to eat any old plant. Why would you want caterpillars in your yard? Well, if you want birds in your yard, you got to have those caterpillars. Chickadees, for example, take 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadees.
An insect apocalypse would devastate the animals that depend on them for food, including humans. We would lose at least a third of our crops, and our food web would collapse.
If insects were to disappear, particularly our pollinators, it would hit certain aspects of our agriculture very hard. The production of fruits and vegetables. Apples, for example, depend on bee pollination. Tomatoes, most of the fruits are bee pollinated. As a matter of fact, in China, where they have lost a lot of their pollinators, they've got guys up on ladders with paintbrushes trying to pollinate peaches and other crops. It's possible, but boy, it is sure easier to keep the pollinators around. The real reason we can't lose our pollinators is because they are pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we would lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. That is not an option. So we need pollinators every place we need plants, which is every place. Anybody who's managing land anywhere, your yard, your corporate landscape, your roadside, they need to be making pollinators, absolutely everywhere.
So the familiar issues of overdevelopment, pesticides, and our ever-expanding population are to blame for the insect population decline. But what can we do about it? Ptolemy points out that the national parks and preserves, while well-intentioned, only separate us from nature and cannot do enough to foster the interconnectivity necessary for biodiversity and recovery. Meanwhile, across the United States and around the world, millions upon millions of acres of land are covered in lawn grass, a symbol of prosperity and social order, but otherwise an ecological wasteland. More than 80% of the United States is privately owned. Ptolemy sees that this is where we must join together to create the solution. We must practice conservation right where we live, work, and farm. Dr. Ptolemy notes that more than 40 million acres of land east of the Mississippi an area the size of New England, is dedicated to lawn space. And turfgrass does essentially nothing to foster biodiversity. He proposes the concept of a homegrown national park.
Conservation has to happen everywhere, which means we've got to learn to share our human-dominated spaces with nature. The easiest thing for a typical homeowner to do is think about reducing the lawn. We have over 40 million acres of lawn in the US. It's a dead space. So I recommend cutting the lawn in half. Cut your area of lawn in half. If everybody did that, that would give us 20 million acres of land we could use in conservation.
Replanting just half of our lawn space with native plants, especially flowering plants, will support the insects that support us and our food web. We need the native plants to feed native bugs, and even the odds for insect and human survival. If we do this, we will create ecological patches and corridors that would equal an area as large as all of our major national parks: Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Grand Tetons, the Grand Canyon, Denali, the Great Smokies, and so on. We will be part of the solution instead of part of the problem.
We've got to think about plants as more than decoration. They do important things, and they've got to start performing those ecological roles in our landscapes. And if we choose the wrong plants, the ones that don't perform those roles, that creates local ecosystem collapse. And if everybody does it, then you get general ecosystem collapse. And there are big ramifications to that. It's the ecosystems on this planet that keep humans alive. They produce ecosystem services, oxygen, clean water, all that stuff. That has to happen everywhere, not just in little parks and preserves. We can create a new national park, call it Homegrown National Park. 20 million acres is bigger than all of our major national parks combined. So you're going to choose those powerful plants. I call them Keystone plants, oaks being the most important plant you can put in your yard. Another thing that any landowner should consider: remove the invasive plants that you have planted ornamentally on your yard. These things have run amok in our natural areas, and we end up with an understory of invasive ornamentals from Asia that aren't supporting our insects, because our insects have not been here long enough to be able to come up with the adaptations needed to get around the chemical defenses that are in those plants from Asia. So it creates biological deserts. And the most responsible thing we can do is to make sure that our property doesn't have any of those invasive plants on it.
Pollination is one of the most critical functions that insects perform. And to accomplish that, they need to have good reasons to travel from place to place and from yard to yard and across the country. And they need to be on the job pretty much all year long.
Plant what we call pollinator gardens, and it's simply a matter of adding flowering plants to your landscape. Pollinators need forage all season long. There are native bees flying from March to November in New England. So in the rest of the country, they're around nearly all the time, which means we need blooming things as continuously as possible.
What more can we do?
Another very important thing we need to do, though, is think about light pollution at night. We turn on our security lights, we have our porch lights on, everybody's got to have a light on. Those lights are killing insects all the time. And I understand people say, I got to have my security light on or the bad man will come. If you put a motion sensor on your security light, it only turns on when the bad man comes. And the first thing you realize is how often the bad man does not come. If we create this homegrown national park, we will bring nature essentially right to our living spaces. It won't be like going to Yosemite, it won't be like going to Yellowstone, you won't have bison, but you will have a lot of those specialized natural interactions right in your yard. And it'll give you the opportunity to either create a personal relationship with nature for the first time or recreate one that you've lost that you might have had as a child. But particularly for our kids, so many of our kids have never had a chance to interact with nature at all. if our kids could walk out their door at their yard and get to establish a relationship with some part of the natural world because it's right there in their yard. Our kids are the future stewards of our planet, and if they don't know what they're stewarding or that they have to steward, they're going to be lousy stewards. So this is an investment in our future. It's an investment in our current health. There's all kinds of health benefits to peaceful times in the natural world. And it will save the biodiversity that runs our ecosystems.
So, is this a big ask of a basic property owner? And where's the proof that this is worth the effort? Talamy's experience with his own 10-acre place, just 15 miles from his office and university classrooms, has turned out to be an ideal suburban ecological experiment. He replaced the invasive plants with native species, and so far, he's counted and photographed more than 1,000 species of moths. It's an indication of what a person with minimal expense and experience can do to be part of an ecological recovery.
My wife and I bought a farm that had been broken up in southeast Pennsylvania. We have 10 acres, but it had been mowed for hay. I mean, there was not much there when we moved in. And actually, they had stopped mowing it for hay, and what was there were all the invasive species from Asia. So our goal was to remove them and put in native plants. And in the meantime, I started to realize how important all of this was. About 4 years ago, I had noticed so many moth species at our house that I made it a goal to start photographing as many as I could. That would be my photographic record of the number of species at our house. I am up to 1,013 species of moths at our house.
The greatest benefit of the Homegrown National Park concept is that it will provide ecological corridors for insects to use to connect and thrive, which will allow us to do the same.
Well, we've also recorded 59 species of terrestrial birds that bred at our house. That's 38% of all the terrestrial birds in Pennsylvania on just 10 acres, which simply says if you put the plants that support our wildlife back into our spaces, the wildlife will come. It's not going to come after they're extinct, so we've got to do it soon. World Wildlife Fund 2 weeks ago said, well, we've lost 2/3 of the wildlife on planet Earth since 1970. And I'm thinking, not at my house. You know, we've gained at least 2/3. I'm sure we've increased biodiversity by more than that, simply by putting the plants back. So the message there is it's reversible. This is not impossible. It is a very gloomy statistic, but if everybody made it a goal to recreate life where they live, you know, 85% of the US is privately owned, or at least east of the Mississippi. We'd be 85% done.